perceive risk? What is risk to you? Do you feel at risk from climate change? Do you feel at risk in other ways? How resilient do you feel? How safe do you feel? These are all questions that Lloyd's Register Foundation and the Gallup organization asked people across the world. About 125,000 people around the world. That's a huge study, people. And the findings are fascinating. So today we're going to find out exactly what they found out from the woman who led it. Welcome to Electric Ladies Podcast, where we bring you insights and tips from remarkably innovative women about corporate responsibility, energy, and sustainability related issues. I'm your host, Joan Michelson. Hang on one quick second. I just had a weird thing happen with my screen that I'm not sure why. So I'm going to pause the recording first. Welcome to Electric Ladies Podcast. We bring you insights and tips from remarkably innovative women about corporate responsibility, energy, sustainability, climate, and ESG related issues. I'm your host, Joan Michelson. We talk about innovation, leadership, technologies, and careers, always bringing a new perspective. We give you specific career advice at the end of every episode, but it's also sprinkled throughout the conversation. So if you're into that, you can listen to that as well. Find us anywhere you like to listen to podcasts, on our website, electricladiespodcast.com, and through my Forbes articles as well. And please pass it on to your friends. And if you are so inclined, leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find us as well. And if you are struggling with your own career, especially in this craziness, please reach out to me on Twitter and let me know. We can help you, no matter what industry you're in. I had the privilege of attending an event at Gallup with Lloyd's Register Foundation about their latest world risk poll. And it was really kind of amazing. It was terrifying, fascinating, inspiring all at once. One of the speakers is a woman you may have heard on this show a couple of times, Michelle Walker, author of You Are What You Risk. And if you want to learn more about how you see risk and manage risks in your own life, you can listen to that episode. Just go to our website and search for risk and you'll find it. But the woman who was the star of the show really was Dr. Sarah Cumbers of Lloyd's Register Foundation, who led the research and gave an amazing in-depth presentation of their findings. Key findings, at least anyway, because obviously they found out a lot. And these findings were, as I said, they were frightening, surprising in some ways, expected in other ways, confirmed certain things, tossed other notions out the window. But it was also inspiring, and now we have information to help people more effectively. Dr. Sarah is Director of Evidence and Insight at Lloyd's Register Foundation. She's been at this work a long time and has a master's degree in biochemistry from Oxford and her PhD from Cambridge University in immunology, and joins us today from the UK. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Cumbers to Electric Ladies Podcast. Welcome, Dr. Sarah. Thank you for joining us. It was great to see you.
Thank you, Joan. It's great to be with you this evening.
Thank you. Yes, it's afternoon in DC and evening in the UK. So for the record, just as I kind of mentioned, the research was done in 2021. So it was done before the Ukraine war, as I understand it. But it was massive. You interviewed over 125,000 people. It's amazing to me, in 121 countries around the globe. How did you get to this many people in this many countries?
Thanks, Joan. So I should really start by talking about Lloyd's Register Foundation. We're a global safety charity. We've got a mission to make the world a safer place, and we invest in research and education and innovation programs around the world that impact on the safety of life and property. And that's why we commissioned this poll, because we wanted to understand how people around the world think about their risk and safety and how they experience different risks. And so we commissioned Gallup, who are the global polling agency that I'm sure many of your listeners will have heard of, to conduct those interviews for us. It's a massive exercise, even for an organisation like Gallup, to go into the field in, as you say, over 120 countries globally and interview over 1,000 people in each country. And so Gallup used their local partners to do that. they translate the questionnaire, they go out into the field and they ask those questions, and then they have very sophisticated mechanisms of processing that data and then analysing that data to access the findings.
So the local partners are really critical in this. Do they interpret the findings, or do you interpret the findings?
No, the local partners are responsible for the data collection, and then that's all through Gallup's sophisticated systems fed back into head office, and then the analysis is done mainly by the brilliant analysts at Gallup, but also with contributions from the Lloyd's Register Foundation staff as well.
Oh, cool, great. So, how did you define risk in this poll, and how do you define risk?
Well, that's an interesting question. And one of the things to note about the poll is that we started in 2019. So 2021 was our second poll. And in fact, we're in the field again in 2023. Gallup are just doing the translations at the moment. And in 2019, we asked, in fact, the sample was bigger because pre-COVID, we could interview more people face to face. And so the 2019 poll included a question about the meaning of the word risk. And we know that people around the world interpret that word differently. And to some, risk is about opportunity, and some it's about harm. I think for me personally, it can be both, and it will just depend on the context. And I'm sure that many people around the world will, and probably your listeners will identify with that. But the great thing about the World Risk Poll data set is that we don't just collect the answers to the questions that we pose to people, but Gallup also ask about other things. So we'll record the sex of the respondent, their income, their educational status, where they live, whether it's rural or urban. And so we can start to look at the data in a really granular fashion to understand what are the factors that are driving, for example, whether people think about risk as opportunity or harm.
Yeah, that's a whole nother topic, isn't it? We could really, to me, it's really both, because in risk is opportunity, right? I mean, there's this line of, never waste a crisis, right?
Yeah.
So you did not define risk in the survey, you just asked people the questions, and they're in effect using the definition that they have in their own head, right? You didn't define it in advance. Okay, that's interesting to know.
With some questions, if we're asking about a specific risk, then we would go into a bit of detail. So, for example, in 2021, we asked about people's experience of violence and harassment in the workplace. And then, because that's linked in with our work with the International Labour Organization, we're very specific to use their definitions of, for example, sexual harassment in the workplace. And then we would be specific. But one of the most ambitious questions that we ask on the poll is, what's the greatest source of risk to your safety in your daily life? And so you can see that with the framing there, you introduce the concept of risk and it being about risk to safety and in daily life, but then you let the respondent interpret that in their own context and give their response.
Are these multiple choice, or are they open-ended so they can use whatever words they want, or are they choosing from the words that you give them?
So with that particular question, one of the reasons it's so ambitious is that it's an open question. And so the interviewer they'll have a list of pre-coded responses that they will then match what has been said against that and give them a particular code. With other questions, they are more closed, and there will be, for example, a list of responses that the individual could select from. So it just depends on the question. Right,
that makes sense. So one of the interesting things I noticed in your presentation was you said that in 2021, 67% of people viewed climate change as a threat to their country. And first of all, that was down a couple of points, which was surprising in and of itself from 2019. But you also said that the percentage of people who saw climate change as, quote, a very serious threat, unquote, remained unchanged at 41%. And that people with an education perceive the threat stronger. Talk about that. Talk about how people perceive climate change as a threat or not, and what stood out to you about that part.
Yeah, thanks. So One of the interesting things about the question about climate change is that we asked this question back in 2019 as well. So we've got that we've got that longitudinal data, so we can analyse, as well as the response to that question, your perception of the threat of climate change to people in your country in the next 20 years, but also we can see that change over time. Actually, in talking to specialist risk communicators who work in the field of climate change and communicating risk about climate change, they viewed the World Risk Poll results quite positively, even though, as you say, there was a bit of a dip in comparison to, across the years between 2019 and 2021. Because at the end of the day, in the intervening year between our polls, obviously COVID happened, right, and people were completely distracted by COVID, by the economic consequences of COVID. So actually to have almost maintained people's awareness of the threat of climate change in spite of COVID, actually for risk communicators, they felt that actually that was a bit of a coup, and it shows how seriously people are taking climate change.
That's a very interesting point. I hadn't thought of it that way at all. Was it different in different countries? Was the perception of the threat of climate change and the gradation of threat? It's obviously in your research it showed differences, but talk about the differences and what other trends or patterns in those countries that you saw that might lump together countries that saw it as more of a risk, or people in countries that saw it more of a risk versus others.
Yeah. So again, looking back to 2019, which is where our first understanding of this data came from, there was a very strong indication in that data that the perception of the threat of climate change wasn't as high in countries who are actually the biggest polluters, who are the biggest carbon emitters. And so we see this reverse pattern, which is really quite concerning. But there are also differences in the way men and women, for example, think about climate change. At the global level, there's actually very little difference between the numbers or the proportions of men and women who say there's a very or a somewhat serious threat. So those numbers are fairly evenly matched. However, women are slightly less likely to say that climate change is not a threat at all than are men. So men generally, globally, are more sceptical. But it's quite dangerous when you look at a poll like this at such a high level to then suggest that that's the general picture everywhere. That's simply the global statistic that abstracts all of that data up to the global level. So it's not as simple as saying that men or women are more worried. We need to look at those granular differences, as you say, at the country level, and particularly actually when it comes to climate change, it's country income that has an impact. So women tend to be more worried about it than men in high income countries. But in low-income countries, it's the reverse. So if you look at Southern Europe as a region, Southern Europe has the highest overall concern about climate change as a serious threat. So here women, 3/4 of women are more likely to view it this way. And with men, it drops to just over 70%, so 71%. So a 3 percentage point difference, which doesn't sound very much, but actually when you're talking about millions of people, actually that's quite a significant. Conversely, in Eastern Africa, men are more likely to view climate change as a very serious threat compared to women. And the difference there is about 4 percentage points. And of course, we can speculate on why that might be. We don't know why that might be, but I can offer you, a few thoughts here. In low-income countries, we know that many men are going to be dependent on agriculture in terms of their livelihood, and we've seen the impacts of severe weather in relation to flooding and drought. And the World Risk Poll across 2019 and 2021 measured people's perceptions of the risk of severe weather and also their experience of severe weather. And we saw that go up by 5 percentage points, which again represents millions and millions of people globally who've experienced severe weather. It's literally life and death for them. However, men in high-income countries who are then insulated from the more immediate effects from climate change, and actually studies have shown are more likely to be the biggest polluters globally because they've got bigger carbon footprints in relation to their energy use, their food consumption, their transportation patterns. So, are they, and again, this is speculation here, but is that lower concern actually a matter of self-interested denial? And that's the reason that actually they're not taking climate change so seriously. But going back to that point I made at the start about fossil fuel consumption, or sorry, let me start that again. So going back to that point that I made just now about the biggest polluters, there's also a correlation if you look at perceptions of risk of climate change in the big fossil fuel producing nations as well. So if you look at the UAE, for example, men are far more likely to say that climate change isn't a threat than are women. And it's also true in Russia. So in Russia, 20% of men say that climate change is not a threat compared to 8% of women. And again, is that because men in these countries are reaping more of the economic benefit of the status quo and so are not as minded to feel concern?
Well, also their livelihood depends upon that industry, and so they see it as a positive, not a negative. Mm-hmm. But the other thing I would pose it, and I'm sure you're sort of alluding to this, is in the poorer countries, the people are focused on survival on a day-to-day basis, and less on natural disasters. I mean, they feel threatened every day, just, women trying to get water. I mean, I was in Africa and watching these women just managing their daily lives takes up all their energy and all their time. And so I would imagine that when you're in survival mode, anything that doesn't threaten you, anything that doesn't deal with your immediate survival, obviously climate change threatens your survival, but down the road. And I want to get to that in a second, but this was so fascinating. Thank you so much for what you just said. And I could ask about 700 questions to go behind that. But one of the things I also wanted to talk about is one of the findings that I saw in the report was that if people, and get to the point of doing something about it, if people experience a natural disaster themselves or know someone who did, then they are more likely to see it as a threat and to do something about it and to want their leaders to do something about it and their communities to do something about it. So did I hear that correctly? I mean, talk about that, for that finding and what you might extract from that, because that's, we need to get people to act, to do something about it, right?
Yeah, definitely. And one of the great things about the World Risk Poll data is that it has now been used by a number of academics. And one of the pieces of research has looked at people's perceptions and their experience of severe weather, and also looked at their perceptions of the threat of climate change. And that research shows that experience of severe weather is a driver of people's concern about climate change. So people are more likely to understand, particularly if they don't have high levels of education, the concept of severe weather because it's something tangible to them. It's something they've experienced, whereas climate change is quite an abstract construct. And that gives climate change communicators a really important tool to be able to connect with people around the world, regardless of their income status, regardless of their level of education, to actually tap into people's increasing experience with severe weather and to make that link then with changing climate. And then you can start to build action strategies on top of that in terms of building resilience, in terms of early warning, early action.
I have found that people in the United States who have experienced extreme weather, like massive hurricanes and Puerto Rico or Florida or New Orleans, for example, there are a lot of those people who, or the floods in Texas, Hurricane Harvey, they still don't get it. They still don't connect the dots, and they just say, oh, well, weather changes and whatever. It's normal cycle. So how do you, what does the data tell us about reaching those people who don't make the connection?
So the United States is a really interesting case study here. And again, this detail is included in our 2019 report, that actually perceptions of the risk of climate change in the United States actually bucks the trend. That as you go further south, you see increasing experience of severe weather, but actually decreasing concern about the threat of climate change. But what it actually does correlate is with political sentiment. And so here then you see those macro factors then starting to impact on people's views and on their risk perceptions. And so it's quite possible with your, with the experience that you've just articulated, Joan, that's what's behind some of these views, that it's people's political persuasion coming in and then starting to colour their risk perceptions.
Yeah, unfortunately, Mother Nature doesn't know blue states from red states and is not being picky here. We're all in this together. One of the other things, and you alluded to this a bit ago, was the correlation with education level. And so, for example, I think one finding I saw was, quote, the likelihood of people viewing climate change as a very serious threat to their country was much lower among those with primary education or less, 32%, than among those with secondary education, 47%, or post-secondary at even 50%. So is that, why is that? Well, because especially if they've experienced climate change themselves, or if they've been in a hurricane or they've been in a flood. This may sound like a pedantic question, but why does education level matter in climate change? It's Mother Nature coming at us. Is it that communicators are using too many multisyllabic words? What is the issue?
Yeah, exactly that. That climate change it's exactly that. That climate change communicators haven't been mindful of the audiences that they need to reach with their communication efforts, and they're using words like mitigation and adaptation. And actually, to the average person on the street, who's just experienced a hurricane, that's what matters to them. It's that tangible experience of severe weather, rather than the labels that scientists and policymakers are attaching to these concepts. And so there needs to be a sea change of communicating on the basis of people's experience, and as I've said, then linking that to the action that can be taken, rather than policymakers continuing to use these terms that actually just don't connect with people who haven't experienced more formal education.
Well, I will definitely take that to heart. I try to define terms when I use them, although my audience is more educated, but I try, especially in my written coverage, I try to define the words a little more. But it's tricky, because a lot of these things, as you well know, you've got a PhD from Oxbridge, as they call it, so you know what we're talking about. So many questions here, but one of the findings that I thought was interesting was what made people think they are at risk, and perceive it. And you broke it down by the individual level and the community level. So I understand if you feel at risk at home from domestic abuse or something like that, but there are, especially in a post-COVID world where in some ways people are more dependent on their community, in other ways they're more isolated from their community. And again, it varies by country, of course, as you know better than I. So how does that play into it? And how does that play into the strategies that we need to employ to try to reach people?
So the 2021 World Risk Poll included a dedicated module on resilience, which is essentially our ability to cope with and then rapidly recover from shocks. And we know that resilience is driven by the interplay of a whole host of complex factors. And as you've said, some of those relate to our individual or our family circumstances, and others are set at a community or even perhaps a society level. And so within this module, within the poll, we asked a series of questions that tap into people's resilience, not using that term and asking them, how resilient do you feel, but asking them, for example, whether they have, whether they feel there's something that they could do in the event of a disaster, whether they have a plan in the event of a disaster, how long they and their family could survive if they lost all of their income, how long could they cover basic needs. And so those questions that I've just talked about are measures of individual resilience. And then at the community level, we ask questions about whether neighbours care about their well-being, which gives you a sense of social capital that the individual has access to. And then we asked about their local infrastructure. And then at societal level, experience of discrimination, and then perceptions of whether the government cares about their well-being. And then taking the results of all of those questions, we brought those together to create a new resilience index. So essentially for each individual poll, they get a number associated with them that tells you how resilient they are, so how able they are to bounce back and recover from shocks. And then you can start to analyse that data, and you can see that actually people with particular backgrounds, particular characteristics or context to their life are less resilient than others. And you can then start to pinpoint these people or these communities for a greater, particular support. But on the converse, you can also see who's doing well, and you can then learn from them, and you can then start to put in place interventions that then help to support resilience in those other communities.
Oh, that's great. I did notice that on one of the charts online that I think, if I was reading it correctly, that 72% of Americans perceive to help each other. Help other people, which I thought was really cool. And that goes to the ethos of giving. In fact, we're dealing with the horrible earthquake in Turkey and Syria now, and a lot of people are rallying to that. A couple other quick questions, and then I'd like to get some career advice from you. One of the interesting things that you highlighted in this research is disaster planning and the importance of disaster planning. But we have all these dynamics playing into this, including on top of it that we live in a moment of a short-term focused society, and yet planning requires, planning, right? So, and that's one of the things that's going on in the United States right now, is we have all this legislation that was passed, but it takes a while for it to trickle through to people, and so they don't really feel like anything's being done because their immediate household hasn't changed, right? Their immediate situation hasn't changed. But it takes time for this to work its way through and for planning to take effect, right? And that also goes to planning for hurricanes and earthquakes, et cetera. So what did you find? And you mentioned agency, which Michelle mentioned on the panel as well, that when we feel like we can do something about it, we feel more in control and it makes us feel more resilient. But if we're not doing the planning, which is something we can do about it, right? And we're not voting for people who can do something about it and will do something about it, then we're kind of in a negative loop. So what did you find about disaster planning, or how people perceive it, an agency that can help us shift that so that people actually take more action to plan for disasters and mitigate against them, to use a word that maybe some people don't know?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we did find in the poll that the majority of people have a disaster plan in just 14 of the 121 countries.
Wow, 14?
14. So and so it's obviously a major issue. But the other interesting thing that we saw, I think this is really quite important, is that people in Southeast Asia were most likely to have a plan. Now, there's actually been quite a major initiative by the World Bank and other agencies in the region because of the increased risk of severe weather events in the region around planning and the importance of planning. And you can actually see that a number of countries in the region are more resilient than they would otherwise be because of this initiative. So, for example, in South Asia, 71% of people feel well prepared. Actually, no, sorry. Let's just scratch that. I've looked at the wrong thing. Where can I restart? Sorry, I've completely lost my train of thought.
That's okay. You are Southeast Asia and countries that
Most
do
likely
more disaster planning.
Yeah. So I think this is quite an important finding that in Southeast Asia, that's the region where respondents in the poll are most likely to have a plan, that they know what to do in the event of a disaster. And that directly links in with the initiative by the World Bank and other agencies that's seen investment in the region in terms of disaster planning. And it's quite clearly from the results of the poll had a big impact on resilience in the region. So in terms of what needs to happen, I mean, I don't know the detail of those of that work by the World Bank, but obviously it has had an impact. So we do know how to do it. So obviously then it's about going back to those, the majority of countries where, going back to those countries where the majority of people don't have a disaster plan in place, and designing interventions to have the kind of impact that we've seen in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, it seems like it has to be mano a mano. It has to be one-on-one almost to get people to do it. I've lived in 8 states, and I lived in California for 17 years, and you learn a certain amount of earthquake planning. I mean, to this day, I won't put any art over my bedroom wall, over my bed in my room. I don't feel safe if I do. And the other is I lived in Fargo, North Dakota, and you learn to keep stuff in the trunk of your car in case of a disaster, right? And it's a reflex now for me. Of course, the problem is you can't keep water because it'll freeze, but that's another topic. So I have so many questions for you, but one of the things, and you touched on this in the beginning, one of the things I totally respect and admire about this work is that Lloyd's Register Foundation is focused on doing something with it, creating an impact and having it be used to facilitate change and make the world a better place, right? So what did you learn from the research about what would be the best solutions, kind of the quickest wins and the most effective strategies to help people, for example, around climate change or any other risks that bubble up for you?
Yeah, so that learning around climate change communication and using clear and simple language is one of the results that's come out of the analysis. If you look at resilience, the key learning really is about taking a granular approach to resilience. That resilience isn't a simple concept that either you have it or you don't. It's very complex, and unless you really understand the context of the community that you're wanting to support, you're going to fail to have an impact and build resilience. And that's one of the great things about this data set, that it can be used in a very granular fashion by all kinds of agencies, civil society, policymakers, academics, etc., governments. And so, part of our job now that the data's in, the results have been analysed, we've had our report launches, is to go on a mission to bring this data to people. So, for example, we've got colleagues going out to China to the UN Data Forum later on this year to talk about the World Risk Poll and to make sure that people are aware of it and that they can use it.
Yeah, and I think also, it's funny that the common phrase of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger seems to be kind of the definition of resilience in some ways, right? If you've gone through it, you are inherently stronger. for the most part, in a lot of ways. I mean, if you've gone through a hurricane, you've survived the other end, right? You come out of it, you have that experience, consciously or unconsciously, has taught you things.
In certain parts of the world, I'd agree, and I'm sure that there are very good examples of that. However, what the World Risk Poll data shows is that actually there's a correlation between people's experience of disaster and low resilience. So actually, if they've experienced multiple disasters and they live in a particular disaster-prone region, there's this concept of shock after shock after shock. And actually, if you don't rebuild and you don't have the investment that you need to rebuild in between, then actually that learning doesn't have a chance to shine through. And that's a really, really important point. So again, it very much depends on your context.
I love that. That's so important. Thank you so much, Sarah, for pointing that out. It's really true. I mean, if you get knocked down repeatedly, right, if you're in hurricane after hurricane after hurricane, like Puerto Rico is still not completely rebuilt, right? Mm-hmm. And it's hard to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and start all over again, right? No, that makes total sense. So I have 800 questions, including like what you're going to ask going forward. And, let me just ask one other quick thing around that is, how do you decide? You want to be able to compare year to year. And I've done a lot of surveys myself, so I'm curious how you deal with this. You want to be able to compare year to year, but you also have different things to ask, right? So like now you might ask about the Ukraine war. You might ask, for example, the earthquake in Turkey and Syria or whatever. The differences in climate change. So how do you adapt for new topics, but then be able to compare year to year?
It's really, really hard. I think it's the hardest part of my job, actually, that you've hit on. It's one of the things that keeps me awake at night, because it feels like a huge responsibility, because essentially the foundation is gifting this data to people with the expectation that they will drive impact and they will increase safety around the world using this data. But that all depends on getting the questions right. And so we have, before the questions are agreed for each round, a huge engagement exercise. We form new relationships. We go back to old relationships and rekindle them in terms of where people feel the data gaps are. But we're not just interested in interesting data. We want data that is actually going to drive impact. So we always ask, and what would you do with it? And what consequence would it have? And how would it change things? And how would it actually make the world safer on the ground? What's the impact on people going to be? And so we have these conversations, and it takes a long time, and we come up with draft sets of questions that then get tested by Gallup. They have a two-phase testing program of cognitive testing, so making sure that the questions are understood, and then pilot testing where they go into more countries, again, to make sure that the questionnaire is going to work. And at each stage, you have to cut some out. And you don't really know exactly what's going to work until you get the results of that. And then eventually you end up with your list of new questions that you'd like to include, and then you sort of, you open the file of what you've done before, and then you have to balance, as you say, those repeats with the new. We've made a big decision for 2023, and we decided to repeat our questions on the Resilience Index because we had a huge amount of interest in that. And there are questions in there like the question about how long you can cover all of your basic needs if you lost all of your income. Well, to ask that question again, in 2023, when we know that the cost of living crisis has really hit with energy prices, with food insecurity, these are global issues, and we just had to include those in the poll in 2023, and we think there'll be a lot of people who are interested in that repeat data. So there's a lot that will be repeated, but we've also got some really exciting new modules. We've again partnered with we're again working in collaboration with the International Labour Organization on a module of questions about harm in the workplace. So we'll be gathering data about the incidence of harm in the workplace and also training that people have received. So that's a module of its own. And then we've also worked with the United Nations Environment Programme with UNEP to ask some questions about how individuals' household waste is collected. Now, it's not a particularly sexy issue. Quite often when you work in safety, it's not sexy, but it's an issue that at the foundation we've been interested in a while, because essentially management of waste is a critical infrastructure issue, and if it's not done appropriately, then there's a safety issue. And it also links in with the climate crisis in the sense that we're asking about the major components of waste. So is it food, is it plastic, is it recycled, is it separated before it's put out? But also we're aware of the fact that open burning is a huge issue as well, that in itself contributes to carbon emissions, as well as being a health issue for those whose livelihoods depend on that. And so that's our really new topic for 2023, and we're really excited to be working with colleagues at the UN Environment Programme and also our own Engineering X programme on those questions.
Oh, touche on that. I look forward to seeing that. So in closing, we like to give career advice to mid-career women. When I say mid-career, I mean at least 10 to maybe even 15 years of experience. They have an education. They are ambitious. They know what they're good at. They want to make money. They want to advance their career, but they also want to make a difference. It's important to make a difference. And you've been extremely lucky to have an extraordinary education and also be able to use, what you know and make a difference every day. It's astonishing. So what advice would you give to them?
I think for me, the defining moment in my... Sorry, this landline never rings.
I don't hear it at all.
Oh, can you not?
No.
Okay, I can't hear it now. Hang on. Can you ask me the question again, and I'll just restart?
Yeah, I mean, he can leave in my question and edit into your answer. But women who want to make a difference with their career, but who are ambitious, they want to make money, they want to advance their career, in whatever field, but they want to make a difference with who they are and what they know how to do and their education. So what advice would you give to them?
My advice would be to really think about what you've done that's unique in your career to date, and how that sets you apart from I'm sorry, this phone it stopped now.
I'm not hearing it.
You're not hearing it. It's just distracting me. So I can just rerun that without your question. So my advice would be to really think about what you bring to your career that's unique to you. I spent a lot of my career working for the public sector in the UK, thinking about the use of evidence in healthcare. And I didn't for a moment think about, until the job at Lloyd's Register Foundation came up, about the fact that actually that was transferable to a different field. I thought I would probably be in healthcare for the rest of my career. And so it's about thinking outside of the box, and thinking about how you could apply what you do, what you know, your network in a different field, and just broadening your horizons.
Oh, I love that. And that's how I got into the green economy, because I didn't work in it. I was actually in management consulting and journalism, and I got recruited by Chrysler to head up communications and co-head the sales and marketing of the electric car division. I didn't live there. I'd never worked in the car business. I didn't even own a car at the time. And but those are the people that really bring innovation, right? So how did you drill down a little bit for us on how you made the decision to go to Lloyd's? I mean, was there some part of you that said, I've been in healthcare, how does this apply? Or, I mean, what was your thinking on it and that? How did you get yourself to okay, this is cool, I accept?
It was a big decision for me. I'd been working for the same organization for 16 years, and that might be another piece of advice. Actually, don't stay for that long. Get out there. Even if you think, I stayed because it was a wonderful organization to work for, and I loved it, and I don't regret it. But I can see that that it limited to a certain extent the experience that I had in my career, and that actually, having dipped my toe in the water, with the foundation, I can see that actually I could have done it earlier. So it's just about recognizing that there are options, I think.
Yeah, and being open to it. And I love what you said about how what you bring to the table can apply to other things.
Yeah.
I call it looking at your career and who you are as pieces in a puzzle. And right now they might look one way, but if you rearrange the pieces, they look like something completely different, right?
Definitely. So it's about having an open mind.
Yes, I love that. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. Any final thoughts before I let you get back to your evening?
Just to say, it's been great talking to you. And if anybody's interested in the World Risk Poll, check out our website, Lloyd's Register Foundation, and look up the World Risk Poll and download the data, and please use it for impact.
Yes, absolutely. Make a difference with it. It's extraordinary. And we've barely touched a tiny bit of the surface. So go for it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on Electric Ladies Podcast. Dr. Sarah Cumbers of Lloyd's Register Foundation and the World Risk Poll and other polls, other research that they're doing. So how do you perceive risk? Do you think you're resilient? Why or why not? Do you appreciate Sarah's definition of resilience, that you can get through whatever? But go back and listen to that. Post your answer to us on Twitter at Joan Michelson and send us any questions there as well. And you may win a complimentary coaching session with me. I have had some recently with some guests, which was really fun. With some listeners, which was really fun. And please subscribe to our mailing list to stay abreast of our talented, amazing guests like Sarah, our articles and career advice. You can subscribe on our website, electricladiespodcast.com. I'm Joan Michelson. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.